Hello Year 11, so here is our second lesson where we are revising A Christmas Carol. Now, if for whatever reason you've picked up these videos on YouTube and you're not one of my students, these lessons assume that A Christmas Carol has already been read and studied. We're not going to be reading the whole of the book, we are going to be focusing on key extracts throughout for our revision. So as always, we're going to begin with vocabulary. So I'd like you to think back to misanthropic. What does it mean to be misanthropic, to describe a person as misanthropic, and how is Scrooge presented as misanthropic in Stave 1? Our second word that we're going to recall from last lesson is destitute. So what does it mean to be destitute, and which characters are presented as destitute in A Christmas Carol? So pause the video, please, and answer those two questions. Now, our new word today is liberality. Liberality is the quality of giving or spending freely. So someone that shows a lot of liberality would be someone who spends their money quite freely or gives their money to others. So you could interpret liberality as someone being quite charitable, giving money to others, giving to charity. So pause the video and note down that definition and our new word, liberality. So how does Scrooge show liberality at the end of the novel? Because he most certainly does not show it at the start. So pause the video and answer that question. So if somebody is misanthropic, they are very unkind, cold, unfeeling, and very antisocial. Pretty much Scrooge at the start in Stave 1. So Scrooge is presented as misanthropic, as we'll see in the extracts we're going to read today, because all he cares about is money and the pursuit of wealth. He does not care about anybody else, not Bob Cratchit, his employee, not Fred, his only living relative, his nephew. Nobody wants anything to do with him, not even beggars would ask him for money in the streets, and blind men's dogs run away from him. We're going to be looking at that extract today. If you are destitute, then you have nothing. You're not just poor. Destitute is another level below that. You have no home, you have no possessions, you have no money, you have nothing. Now, we have the Cratchits who represent the poor here. What we don't see is destitute. The closest we possibly get to destitution in this novel is in Stave 4, when Scrooge goes into the future and he's taken to go see the spirits. He sees Jess, is that you?
Yes.
Hello, darling. This
Hello.
is a live lesson. I'm actually recording one.
Oh, okay.
Are you all right?
Yeah, this laptop's confusing me.
The trouble is that the only way I can record them is I have to have a meeting with myself and talk at myself. So it probably might have looked a little bit confusing that it suddenly popped up on our Teams group. But our live lesson is on Wednesday.
Okay.
So you should hopefully have had an email through or whatever to that. It's called a learning lab. So yeah, on Wednesday we'll have an actual proper lesson with everyone, which will be nice.
Okay, is that where I do all my about the Christmas Carol?
Yeah, so yeah, that's going to be the first A Christmas Carol lesson. Today you should be doing the lesson that I uploaded on the assignments about preparing to do a, what's it called? An Inspector Calls practice question.
Oh, okay, that's right.
Yeah, that was today's work. So look on the assignments and look for the one dated the 11th. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, darling. See you later.
Bye.
Bye. So destitute. What we have is the characters who are destitute in Stave 4 are the people described when Scrooge sees old Joe and his sort of pawn shop where these people have come to sell Scrooge's belongings. The destitute are described in that section of the novel. So liberality then, how does Scrooge show liberality at the end of the novel? Well, he becomes generous. He gives a large amount of money to charity. He gives a huge turkey anonymously to the Cratchits. So he becomes someone very generous of heart, spirit and money. A massive contrast to the bit that we're going to look at today. So today your knowledge goal is to revise the juxtaposition of character traits in Scrooge, Fred and Bob in Stave 1. Now remember, a juxtaposition is when we look at two or more things to sort of contrast them. So how is Scrooge, Fred and Bob sort of contrasting one another in their presentation in Stave 1? So pause the video and note down the knowledge goal, please. We're also going to look at Dickens' intentions. Why does he choose to juxtapose their characters? So we're going to switch over to the visualizer now and have a little bit of a look at the opening description of Scrooge in Stave 1. We're going to read it through and then I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint and we're going to look at how Dickens presents Scrooge here. Why does he choose to present Scrooge in this way? So I am going to attempt to seamlessly move over now to camera, which will hopefully show you unless it just fell on the floor. Oh, I'd be a rubbish Blue Peter presenter. I'm not very good at doing. Here is one I did earlier. Right. So hopefully this should be reasonably familiar to you. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. So we have some great quotations here. We have him as tight-fisted, this wonderful string of verbs. I particularly love covetous old sinner. Now, if you covet something, you want it. So we have this impression that Scrooge is never happy with what he's got. He's always wanting more. And again, we've spoken a lot about Christian allegorical readings of things. This idea of him as a sinner is this whole Christian concept of the fact that if you die an unrepentant sinner, then you go to purgatory or hell, which we know is going to be Scrooge's fate if he doesn't change. Hard and sharp as flint is a nice simile here. Flint can be used, is a rock, but can be used to strike fire. So quite a nice way of interpreting this simile is that whilst he's hard and sharp, again, showing this idea of him being unfeeling and very hard-hearted, this is also a bit like the solitary as an oyster. There's a glimmer of hope. Flint can be used to start a fire, which again is light imagery, showing that there is the potential for good in Scrooge, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. So it's this idea that actually no one has been able to get generosity out of Scrooge. Secret and self-contained, I can't believe I've just dropped. It's because I'm wearing gloves and a jacket because it's so absolutely freezing in this classroom. I keep dropping everything. Secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. Now, I hope if you remember nothing else from last year, you remember solitary as an oyster. This is a fantastic and important simile, because what we're essentially seeing here is solitary means alone. So Scrooge is as alone as a sort of oyster, but actually it's the oyster that's more important than solitary, really, because what we see here is an oyster is very closed up, very shut up, very hard to break open. But once you do, there is a pearl inside. So this solitary as an oyster is insinuating that deep, deep down inside of Scrooge, beneath this frosty outer layer, is a decent human being. And actually what we need is someone to chip away at this shell and to really, really work on opening him up. And if you do, he has the potential to be a really wonderful man. So solitary as an oyster is a very important piece of language here. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait. Gait just means posture. Made his eyes red. It's almost quite demonic there, isn't it? His thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. Now, this is some physical description of Scrooge. Thin lips. He's got a grating and unpleasant voice. He's got red eyes, shriveled cheeks. It's a very physically unpleasant image. And again, we tend to associate attractive people with being good, which is slightly absurd, really, when you think about it. But we can't help it. If someone is attractive and easy on the eyes, we tend to associate positive things with them. With Scrooge, it's different. It's very negative. It's got a very negative appearance. We have this sort of metaphorical idea of cold. You know, he's not some sort of weird supernatural ice creature or something. But this cold is this extended metaphor for this idea that he is very emotionally cold. He's, his heart is frozen. And this frosty rime is essentially this sort of frosty outer layer, a little bit like this oyster shell. It's this metaphorical layer of ice that he's put up around himself so nobody can sort of get in emotionally. So a frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrow and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. Sorry, I'm good at highlighting this. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw at 1 degree at Christmas. Now, dog days mean really hot days and didn't thaw at 1 degree at Christmas. So he's emotionally cold even when it's boiling hot outside, and he doesn't even become more pleasant at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. So again, we've got the weather being used metaphorically here. So far, there's been nobody, I can't believe I've just dropped another highlighter. We've had nobody that's been able to get through to him. Nobody has been able to warm this frosty sort of layer and melt it away. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. So again, we've got this metaphor of the weather. Scrooge is described as being all of this nasty sort of heavy rain, for example, and frost. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast down of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. That's again just Dickens being wryly amused by this idea that you could say, oh, you know, look at that rain, that's really coming down, isn't it? But this idea of coming down handsomely and Scrooge never did is showing that Scrooge never changes. He's always going to be greedy and selfish. So whereas the weather can be changeable, Scrooge isn't. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, my dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me? So nobody stops him in the streets and wants to speak to him. No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what o'clock it was. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, no eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master. Now, there's a couple of ways to interpret this, but one of them is the dogs, if the dogs could speak, they would say to their owners, you're better off being blind than gazing upon such an evil man as Scrooge. So people see him in the street and they literally cross the other way to avoid him. That's how dislikable he is. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. So basically, Scrooge loves this idea of everybody leaving him alone. He is not interested in anybody showing him companionship, in passing the time. So I'm attempting to upload our PowerPoint back up. We're going to go back to the task we stopped on. So what I would like you to do is pause the video, write a brief summary, a few sentences of how Dickens is presenting Scrooge here. Then add on to that, why do you think he chooses to present Scrooge in this way? So think about Dickens' intentions. Why present Scrooge as so misanthropic and dislikable? Is he successful in the way he presents him? And then just jot down 2 or 3 good quotations that you would use to describe Scrooge. So it might be solitary as an oyster, for example, covetous old sinner. Okay, so pause the video and give yourself 5 minutes in order to complete that task. So we are going to switch back over to the visualizer now, hopefully, and we are going to read the little paragraph that is about Bob Cratchit and poor old Bob's working conditions. So the door of Scrooge's counting house was open so that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond a sort of tank was copying letters. So he wants to keep his eye on Bob. He doesn't trust him. Where Bob is working is described as a dismal, miserable little cell. Cell is like a prison, almost a tank. There's almost this animalistic imagery here that, you know, Bob is viewed as less than human. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so much very smaller that it looked like 1 coal. Now, Scrooge himself has a small fire, and we know that Scrooge doesn't use his own money to make himself happy, but poor Bob's fire is so small, it's as if he has a single lump of coal. So again, this fire is really important because what it's symbolising is the difference in status between Scrooge and Bob. Bob can't go and get more coal for the fire, because as we're told, but he couldn't replenish it, he couldn't get more coal, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. So if Bob went and helped himself to more coal, he'd lose his job. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter. Now, every time we see Bob in this book, this comforter is mentioned. Now, this is a long scarf because he cannot afford a winter coat, so he wraps himself in the scarf. And he tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. So poor old Bob can't even, see properly enough. He's only allowed a single candle in order to do his work. So what we're going to do now, once I bring the PowerPoint back up, is you're going to do the same as you've just done with Scrooge, but we're going to focus on Bob. Sorry, I have to keep going through all of the PowerPoint. So, how does Dickens present Bob's working conditions? How does this make us feel towards Bob? What signs does Dickens give us of Bob's poverty here? And how does this influence how we feel about Scrooge? So pause the video, just give a brief answer to those 4 questions. You may choose to answer them separately, or you may choose to just write a small summary paragraph that includes all of that information. So pause the video now and give yourself a couple of minutes to answer those questions. So the next bit we're going to read today is Fred. Now, Fred is Scrooge's nephew. He is the son of Scrooge's sister Fan, who died at some point in her adult life. We don't know when. Some critics believe it may have been giving birth to Fred, which is why Scrooge has a negative relationship with him, but that's all conjecture. There's lots of gaps really in Scrooge's past that Dickens doesn't really give us any explicit information on. But either way, Scrooge has a very negative relationship with Fred. So we're going to switch back over to the visualizer, and we're going to keep reading and see good old Fred. Now remember, Fred is our Sheila of The Christmas Carol. He's our model for just generally being an amazing human being. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle. God save you," cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew. It came about him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. So he's cheerful. We're automatically getting a positive impression of him. "Bah," said Scrooge, "humbug." He was so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. Now you should remember from last time we did this novel, any time a character is glowing or sparkling, they are good people. We know in this book, light equals good, dark equals bad. And Dickens uses this juxtaposition of light imagery and dark imagery throughout. So if a character is glowing, we know that they are good and we are meant to like them. His face was ruddy, that's like red-cheeked, and handsome. So we're back to this idea of if people are attractive, they're supposed to be good, although in this case, Fred is. And his eyes sparkled. So here we go. You know, not only is he glowing, he's got sparkly eyes too. And his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I am sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." Now, to Scrooge, the only reason to ever be happy is to have a lot of money. Now, a lot of people look at this line and they think that Fred is poor. Now, Fred isn't poor, not on the level of, say, Bob Cratchit. Fred is probably really typically sort of middle class. He's certainly financially comfortable. What he's not is mega rich like Scrooge, okay? Because remember, Scrooge has spent his whole adult life pursuing and gaining more money. So he's only poor compared to Scrooge, but rich compared to someone like Bob. "Come then," returned the nephew gaily. Gaily means happily. So he's not letting Scrooge sort of bring the mood down. "What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." So he's sort of flinging it back on Scrooge, really. "Well, why are you miserable then? Because if you're so rich, you should be happy." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said "bah" again and followed it up with "humbug." "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be," returned the uncle, "when I live in a world of fools such as this? Merry Christmas, out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a round dozen of months presented dead against you? If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should." So essentially, Scrooge is showing an incredibly negative impression of Christmas here. He views people who celebrate it as fools and idiots. "Uncle," pleaded the nephew. So Fred's quite shocked by this. "Nephew," returned the uncle sternly, "keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine." So he's like, "Just leave me alone. I'm not interested." "Keep it," repeated Scrooge's nephew, "but you don't keep it." So he's saying you don't celebrate it. "Let me leave it alone then," said Scrooge. Much good may it do you. Much good it has ever done you." So Scrooge is saying, well, Christmas has never benefited you. Why would you bother? "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew, "Christmas among the rest." So he's saying there are lots of things that has done me good that hasn't involved making money. You know, life is not about making money. Life is about doing good and being a good person. That's Fred's view, his philosophy. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin. That's to do with, obviously, it's a sacred time for Christians because it's the birth of Jesus, etc. If anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. Now, these are some of the most important lines of the novel. We see Dickens give his own personal views on society and how it should be through various characters, such as Fred and also the ghosts, the spirits themselves. This is why Dickens chose to set this novel at Christmas. He views Christmas as the one time of the year when everyone views those below them, so the poor, as if they were fellow passengers to the grave, as if they were fellow human beings and not some inferior group of people that we should look down upon. It's a time when we open our shut-up hearts freely, when we're more kind, forgiving and charitable to people. That is the power of Christmas for Fred. And here, a bit like the inspector in Inspector Calls, who is J.B. Priestley's mouthpiece, here Fred is being Dickens' mouthpiece. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say, God bless it. The clerk, this is Bob in the tank, involuntarily applauded, becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, so he realises he probably shouldn't have done that, it would make Scrooge cross. He poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. Now, this fact that he puts out the fire because he's afraid of Scrooge's reaction, again, there's more symbolism to be found there. This idea that actually the negativity of men like Scrooge negatively affects good moral people like Bob, and that is represented here by the fact that this pathetic fire has now gone out. Let me hear another sound from you, Scrooge is saying this to Bob, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir, he added, turning to his nephew. I wonder you don't go into Parliament. So he's being sarcastic, really, to Fred. Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said that he would see him, yes. Sorry, can't see that very well. Yes, indeed, he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. So he's basically saying there's no chance he'll ever go to Fred's for Christmas. But why? Cried Scrooge's nephew. Why? So why, Fred doesn't understand why Scrooge won't, be friendly with him. Why did you get married? Said Scrooge. Because I fell in love, says Fred. Because you fell in love, growled Scrooge, as if that were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. So we see that it's not just Christmas that Scrooge looks down upon, but this whole concept of love, family and marriage as well. Good afternoon. Now he's saying that as a sort of passive-aggressive goodbye, really. Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened, so before I got married. Why give it as a reason for not coming now? Good afternoon, said Scrooge. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends? So Fred's like, I don't want anything from you. I don't want your money. I just want a relationship with you. Good afternoon, said Scrooge. I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party. So he's like, I don't understand. We've never had an argument. But I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, uncle. And Fred clearly tries to reach out to Scrooge every Christmas, even though Scrooge rejects him. Good afternoon, said Scrooge. And a Happy New Year. Good afternoon, said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge. for he returned them cordially. So what we have here again is poor Fred being completely rejected by Scrooge. But what we have is Fred sharing some very important ideas which Dickens wants us to think about. So for the final time, I'm switching back to our PowerPoint, which should appear any second in its own sweet time. So there's a few questions here that I would like you to respond to. How does Dickens choose to present Fred here? Why does he want to present Fred in this way? What is the significance of Fred's sparkling eyes? Can you remember any other characters from when we studied the book last year or your revision over Christmas where Dickens uses light imagery to present them? What message is Fred giving about Christmas here? How is this representing Dickens' own beliefs? And how does Scrooge react to Fred's message? And how does this develop our opinion of him? So pause the video, maybe give yourself, again, a sort of another 10 minutes or so to answer those questions. Now, the final thing I'd like you to do is write a brief response to this evaluative question. Dickens successfully emotionally manipulates the emotions of the reader by making them like Bob and Fred and dislike Scrooge. To what extent do you agree with this question? Now, you only have to write a single paragraph here, but what I would like you to do is I would like you to state whether you agree or disagree with the statement that Dickens is successful in his emotional manipulation of us because we dislike Scrooge and like Bob and Fred, and try and refer to some specific examples to justify whether you agree or whether you disagree. So you can pause the video and give yourself about 5 minutes to do that. So finally, I'd like you to answer the following question here in the pink box, just to have a little summary of what we've learned today. Why did Dickens intend to show Scrooge's lack of liberality in Stave 1? Go back to your notes from the start of the lesson if you need a recall of what liberality is. Right, well done, guys. There's been quite a lot to do today. In our next lesson, we will look a little bit further on at this stave and think about the charity workers and Jacob Marley. See you next lesson.